Well, I'd like to welcome you all to this second DVD on the fascinating English opening. And, well, I guess you've already watched the first DVD if you're here with me now. This DVD covers separate things, obviously, to the first DVD. And we're going to be covering the symmetrical English, which is an incredibly popular opening. So the symmetrical English obviously starts and moves to C4, C5. So that's going to be a big load of the coverage in this DVD, and I'm going to give you some exciting ways to play here. We're also going to be covering systems, well, pretty much everything else I can think of. So there's lots of transpositional things with the English defence, so you have to be quite flexible when you're playing with the white pieces, and this is one of the great things with the English, and this is one of the reasons that I think most of the top players are now playing the English, because it's such a flexible opening that's not solved. It's an opening you can't really solve. For example, some openings that are so tactical, there's going to be a definite sort of verdict at the end. But with the English, it's more positional in nature, and you're going to have more long games. So it's not going to necessarily peter out to a drawn position as quickly, even though the English has got a reputation of being a rather drawish opening. I think that's completely wrong, and this has been proven at top level. So other things we're going to look at here, well, we're starting with the symmetrical, but we're also going to look at setups that black can play with knight to f6 and g6, so this kind of a system. We're also going to be looking at sort of Grunfeld ideas here quickly with d5. We're going to touch really upon most things that we haven't covered in the first DVD, but starting with the symmetrical English. Now, what variations am I going to suggest in the DVD? Well, against the symmetrical English, I want to play the variation with knight c3, and to start with, let's just say black copies us, so knight to c6, and now g3 here. So I was considering making knight to f3 our main weapon here, and I think this is a very decent move, but I think if you're going to play the English and play into symmetrical positions, then it's worth looking at the g3 move order in more detail and more depth. And the particular systems I'm going to recommend are, well, again, let's say black copies us. We're going to go for this position, and here there's so many different setups that you can play, but the move I'm recommending is a3 here. This is an attempt to break the symmetrical nature of the position and to plough ahead on the queen side with b4 at the right moment, gaining a small edge. Now, in my history, I've played a number of moves here. I used to play what's called the Botvinnik system. So I'll just quickly discuss some of these other setups, which could be useful for you if you have been playing them, have been facing this with the black pieces, and I'm just going to tell you my personal opinion on some of these positions. Well, the Botvinnik system traditionally is set up with e4, knight ge2, and d3. Let's say you go d3 first. This is one way of reaching the position, and then d6 here, for example, and now e4. Now, personally, I believe there's a couple of problems with the Botvinnik system. The first problem, which I wasn't able to solve easily, was what do you do if black simply copies you and goes e5? And this is kind of a move that not many players play, because it's obviously very, very drawish, but we're playing with the white pieces and we want to get some kind of edge, and I've always struggled against this setup in the Botvinnik system. Or simply, if we go e4 here, what if black goes e5? And because of the closed nature of the position, I think it's very hard for white to prove an edge in this kind of structure. The other reason I'm not suggesting the Botvinnik system is that I think a plan involving knight to f6 here, and let's say we go a couple more moves with the Botvinnik, knight on g to e2, for example, castles here, I believe that black is very comfortable with correct play. For example, I think a very accurate move order here for black is something like bishop to d7. White often goes h3, and white generally has a couple of ideas here. White can go rook b1 and aim for b4 again, but if we're going to do that, why don't we do it immediately? This is one of my reasoning why we're going to play a3 in an early stage, because I don't really see the point of doing it later on when we've committed our pieces to a definite setup. The other line that white can play is with f4 and f5, but this I think is rather dubious, because black often gets his counterplay in on the queen side, and even if we get our pawn to f5, our pawn to g4, g5, it's very hard to break down black's setup, and I know this from experience. The other thing that white can do is to try to play for the move d4, and h3 prepares bishop to e3, and I'd say this is one of the main lines of the Botvinnik. But now I'm always concerned about the move knight to e8, and this is a line that Fischer played, and I just can't recommend this line for white, because I'd rather be black in these positions, and I think this has been proven at top level. Now, knight to e8 is a very clever idea. The knight aims to come to c7, to e6, to d4, to take a very good square. If white plays rook to b1 here, black just continues with the plan, knight to c7. If a3, black just stops this plan with a5, and he's going to continue knight e6 to d4, and I think this is very promising. If white plays bishop to e3 here, trying to meet knight to c7 with d4, okay, well, that might give white something, even though I think black is totally fine in this position with accurate play as well. One of the problems I would consider this position is the move knight to d4, Fischer's idea. And then after something like rook b1, Fischer played a5, and after a3, simply knight to c7. b4, capture, b6. And I don't think white can claim any type of advantage in this kind of position. I mean, maybe not b6 here, but this type of structure just seems, I mean, Fischer had this, it just seems very comfortable for black, with the knight coming here, etc. And yeah, I can't give this as a recommendation. This whole setup, the Botvinnik system, I wanted to recommend, but I just don't believe it's white's best way to play. And if we look at the games of grandmasters, we will see that grandmasters avoid playing e4 and avoid entering into the Botvinnik system. I think for these two reasons, that if black wants to draw, he goes e5. If black wants to play, then he plays this maneuver of knight to e8, which offers him a very good hold of the d4 square. So that's why in the standard position I've recommended a3, which to me tends to lead to more dynamic, more exciting and more interesting positions. White can push forward with the move b4 quite quickly and at least gain some space and initiative on the queen side. And the kind of setup we're going for here really depends on what black plays, so we have to be flexible. But as a rule, we're just trying to play b4 first, gain some initiative over there. I've then kind of angled and picked a setup where we don't play e4, so we avoid the Botvinnik system, but we go for e3 and knight ge2 and something like d3, a very solid and flexible system, and b4, and just trying to play a long game with slight advantage. This is the kind of setup that I've picked to play in the symmetrical. Now, there are some move order tricks here and things you have to be aware of. For example, if black plays knight to f6, knight to c3, g6, well, if we go g3 now, we allow some kind of Grunfeld opening, which we will cover this position because I think it fits into our repertoire. If we go knight to f3, then we get a different kind of system, and one that I'm not going to be covering here, after something like bishop g7, g3, and now black can at some point play c5. And we're avoiding putting our knight on f3 too soon. The whole setup I'm trying to base the repertoire around is a setup where before we commit our knight on g1, we go for queenside play with this plan. And it can get very tactical as well, which is quite interesting because, again, quite a boring reputation, the English, but great players like Hodgson, great tactical players like Hodgson have played this line and got very good victories. But talking about the move order issues, after something like g3, bishop g7, bishop g2, move order issues I had was, what after d6, what do we play? Because now black keeps the option of c5 available, but also the option of e5 available, playing a King's Indian defence kind of structure. And this is quite important as well, because you'll face this a lot of time when you're playing your games. Now, what I've tried to do here is, again, against an early c5, I'm angling for a quick b4, trying to give us an edge there. But against an early e5, I'm going for a solid setup where we still go for b4. So I'm trying to keep consistency with our ideas. But in this line, if black does play e5, I'm trying to put our knight on the f3 square. So we could have some setup with d3 and e5 and knight to f3. Only now that the e5 has been played, castles, castles, and here we're going for the queenside march with rook b1, b4, b5, and our knight often drops back to e1. We're playing on the queen side and sometimes in the centre of the board, and black is going to try to do stuff on the king side, but our king is very safe and solid in this setup. So this is really what a bulk of the DVD is about. The symmetrical English with our interesting idea of a3, trying to play b4 quickly. Very interesting way to play, and one of the most interesting ways to play. This is why I've picked it. Against the King's Indian setup, we are going to go for this queenside play as well. So it's similar in theme. So if black plays e5 instead of c5, we're still going to go for b4. So b4 is a main setup we're angling for. Other things we cover in this DVD, we cover the English defence, which starts with b6, or even 1 e6. So both these moves, as long as b6 is played next, we cover this, and I think I find a very good variation for white there. We also look at a Slav setup, so what to do against 1 c6 to keep the position unique. And it's quite similar to what I recommended in the first DVD. Again, trying to keep a simple repertoire for us and something you can remember without too much effort. Just to let you know, the line I recommended after d5 is e3. And this is the same setup I recommended in the first DVD. Very unique and interesting setup. Of course, I mentioned in the first DVD that it's always worth learning these positions with d4, but it's outside the scope of this DVD, so I haven't touched upon this. Other move order things we have to be careful of. For example, after knight c6, g3, black can now be quite crafty and try to play a quick d5, and this is again something I had trouble with. Or for example, after knight c3, knight f6 here, this is probably knight f6 here, this is probably a better move order for black. g3, he could aim for an early d5. So we consider what happens if black goes d5 here, and we also consider what happens if black tries to go d5 and capture on d5 with his pawn. Now, just quickly, what I'm recommending in this move order, because obviously I don't want to play knight f3 because it doesn't really fit in with our setup. Again, I want to play g3 because now we can transpose to lines we look at if our opponent goes g6, or if our opponent goes knight to c6. We transpose to ideas we've seen before, rook b1 and a3. But if our opponent goes d5, I'm recommending a line by capturing, bishop g2, and a disruptive check on a4 here, which has scored very well for white. So this covers this line. And another popular line, which we have to cover, is what happens instead of d5 immediately, e6. And this is quite a rare occurrence, but black is trying to get a Tarrasch opening. Now, yet again, this is a tricky move order, and as I want to cover everything, I really don't want to give you something a bit shabby as a defence. I want to give you something which is at least going to give you a decent position. So I spent a long time in this trying to think of alternatives to the main variation, but against this particular setup, and only this particular setup, where black is aiming to play d5 and capture with a pawn on d5, I am suggesting now we transpose in the Tarrasch opening the knight to f3. And to keep this quite unique, this DVD, after d5, which is the logical move, takes, we are going to have a brief look at the Tarrasch opening. And of course, this opening probably deserves a whole DVD of its own. But so you've got a full repertoire. I thought it's very important to include this in our DVD. I don't want to leave you lacking. And this is now the Tarrasch opening. To make this a little bit different, what I've recommended in the main position after castles, rather than playing bishop to g5, heavily analysed and, well, there's a lot of theory on this, I'm going to be recommended the slightly odd but still dangerous move, bishop to f4. And we will have a look at some ideas on this, just to keep the position a little bit unique and not so theory heavy. And I think this is a good idea because I trying to avoid mainline d4 openings because it's an opening DVD on the English opening. So I couldn't find any way around this suggestion after e6 of what we should play, except for playing knight to f3, which I believe is the best move. And then taking, entering to a Tarrasch, but to keep the position unique, we're looking at bishop to f4. So those are the main things that this DVD covers, and hopefully after watching this DVD, and probably the first DVD, you'll be prepared for everything in the English defence. So we'll move on to the games very shortly. I hope this DVD is obviously very useful to you. And, well, I introduced myself in the first DVD. I won't bother doing that again, but just to let you know, I'm not one of these players who's suggesting something and never played it myself. I've played the English defence on and off since the age of 6, so that's nearly 20 years, 30 years, wow, I'm getting old. But I have a great deal of experience in it and have looked at many ideas over my lifetime, so I should be able to give you some good lessons in it. And like the first DVD, and because it's a DVD on the English and not one of these incredibly theoretical lines where if you make one mistake you lose, I'm going to try to tell you the ideas behind the moves and what you're trying to plan. So even if you forget your theory, forget the particular move in a particular position, hopefully you'll be thinking a similar way to me, and you'll know what ideas you should be trying to achieve and what ideas of your opponents you should be trying to stop. That's your idea. Let's hope that works. You can obviously tell me after you watch the DVD if it's been a success or a failure. Please be a success. I'll do my best anyway to make it as enjoyable and basically information heavy as I can.